Our speaker today is Stan Deaton, who is the Director of Publications and Scholarship for the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. He is the Assistant Editor and Book Review Editor for the Society's scholarly journal, the Georgia Historical Quarterly. And if you are a member of the Georgia Historical Society, you get sent this. It's very interesting. This one I think has an article on Bobby Jones. If you're not a member of the Georgia Historical Society, you have the opportunity to join. There's some of these brochures, and again, they need your support too. So please pick up one of these if you can. Stan is a native of Georgia. He has his bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia. He has a PhD in history from the University of Florida. He is a lecturer, a book reviewer, and a writer. And last weekend, he moderated a program in Atlanta on the profiles and leadership of the founding generation, a roundtable discussion that was very interesting. And I hope it's going to be on not TV, it's going to be on Georgia Public Broadcasting Radio perhaps, and maybe on C-SPAN. So look out for that. It was a very interesting discussion. And this is an area that Stan is very interested in, and today he's going to talk to us about Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay this morning? Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be back in Thomasville. It's been a while since I've been here, and it's really, you guys are really impressive historical society. I do a lot of this and see a lot of historical societies around the state, and I can tell you without a doubt that Thomas County is one of the best and one of the most impressive. We had a very nice job over here today, and you were talking about the Georgia Historical Quarterly. My wife drove, and I read proof of the quarterly all the way over here, so working on a Sunday. But I'm glad this is not Super Bowl Sunday. When Ann first called me and invited me, she said, you know, it's always on Super Bowl Sunday, and I had already said yes before I could say no. She didn't tell me that until afterwards, so I was kind of looked on the internet and found out that it wasn't Super Bowl Sunday. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. Glad to see Mr. Bill Raker again. I had the pleasure to be in Savannah a couple of years ago. Thomas Jefferson, whom we're going to talk about this afternoon. Sorry?
Just a little bit.
Adjust it down or up? Too close to me? Okay.
There you go.
How's that?
There you go.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to lean or rattle. The standard biography of Thomas Jefferson is a 6-volume work by Alone, who you may have heard of, you may have even read, you may own it. The standard 1-volume biography of Thomas Jefferson runs to well over 1,000 pages. So remember that as you sit and listen to me talk about Thomas Jefferson, that you're getting off easy here. And remember that this is called, it was originally called An Evening with Thomas Jefferson and not 5 Minutes with Thomas Jefferson. Shortly after the election of 1800, a Virginian stopped the country inn in his home state and fell into conversation with a stranger over dinner. In the course of conversation, the stranger mentioned some mechanical operations he had seen recently, and the Virginian's knowledge of the subject convinced the stranger that he was talking to an engineer. They began talking about agriculture, and the man decided, no, the Virginian must be a farmer. More talk led him to believe that he was a lawyer. Then he decided that he must be a physician. Finally, the subject turned to religion, and the stranger concluded that he was talking to a minister, though he could not be sure of the denomination. So, the dinner finished, they parted. The next day, as he prepared to leave, the stranger asked the landlord for the name of the tall stranger that he had engaged in such lively conversation the night before. Don't you know the squire? The landlord said, that was Mr. Jefferson. Not President Jefferson, he said. Yes, President Jefferson. Now, whether or not the story is true, it is not misleading. Thomas Jefferson has been rightly called America's Renaissance man. When President John F. Kennedy entertained a group of Nobel Prize winners in the White House in December 1962, he welcomed them as the most distinguished gathering of talent ever assembled in the executive mansion, except, as you know, for when Jefferson dined there alone. Who was Thomas Jefferson? It's a question Americans have been asking since the day he died more than 175 years ago, and the answer is not an easy one. There was Jefferson the man and Jefferson the historic figure, and I'll talk about both of them in this lecture. Historians, writers, authors, and playwrights, movie makers have puzzled over the man, perhaps more than any other single American figure. It may be true that more books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than any other historical figures except Christ and Shakespeare, but Jefferson cannot be far behind. And you know this if you've been to any bookstore. There are innumerable volumes about it. And every aspect of his life and more keep appearing every year. And they have titles like Jefferson in Gardening and Jefferson in Love. And to my knowledge, no one's ever read the book about Lincoln and gardening. There are books about Lincoln and love, even one out now about Lincoln being gay. But lots of historical impersonators make a good living being Thomas Jefferson. And of course, hundreds of thousands of visitors every year make the pilgrimage to the mountaintop to visit Monticello and his grave. He is at once a fascinating, complex, mostly likable, sometimes maddening individual who defies easy explanation. Joseph Ellis called him the American Sphinx, for despite leaving over 18,000 letters behind, an unparalleled documentary monument, he remains frustratingly unknowable in so many ways we'd like to know him. He has been described as America's everyman, because with Jefferson, we get everything. Democracy versus aristocracy, the people against the elite, North against South, East versus West, the agrarians against the industrialists, Democrats against Republicans. Everybody and every cause attaches themselves to Jefferson. Southern secessionists cited him when they espoused states' rights. Northern abolitionists quoted his words in the Declaration of Independence when they attacked slavery. Conservative businessmen quote his words about the dangers of a meddling and intrusively large government. Farmers quote his words about the superiority of those who labor in the earth. Reformers quote his warnings about the dangers of the corruption of businessmen. Both sides in the civil rights struggles in the 1950s and 60s thought that he would be on their side, and in the recent controversy over the Ten Commandments monument in Alabama, both sides quoted his words and firmly believed that they had him in their camp. In fact, every time a new biography of Jefferson comes out, if there's an election going on, you will see both candidates quote him and act as if he's on my side. They always do that. By the middle of the 20th century, Jefferson had become all things to all people. As one historian said, Jefferson was no longer just an essential ingredient in the American political tradition. He was the essence itself of that tradition, a kind of free-floating icon who hovers over the American political scene like one of those blimps cruising above a crowded football stadium, flashing words of inspiration to both teams. He represents in microcosms the inherent contradictions of citizenship in this great republic. When protesters take to the streets, we're not sure if we should admire them for hearkening back to the origins of our country or condemn them for disrupting order. We love the idea of our nation and what it means, but there is an anti-government streak in us a mile wide, and it is quintessentially Jeffersonian. And all of this happened, of course, as the country became more like the America envisioned by his greatest rival, Alexander Hamilton, an America of big government and big business. We live in a world now that Jefferson would scarcely recognize. I can't remember the first time I ever heard of Thomas Jefferson, but I cannot remember a time when I didn't know who he was. I visited his home many times, the first time when I was 10 years old. And the first time I made the pilgrimage to the mountaintop, I'm not sure that I fully understood who he was. But that visit marked the beginning of a lifelong journey of discovery about the man we call the Sage of Monticello, and it has been a labor of love, I'm not ashamed to say. I began reading about him then, and he is as fascinating now as the first time I met him. You can continue to learn things about him, and you will never learn everything about him. I know why I liked him as a 10-year-old. I liked him because he lived in that great big wonderful house, and he loved books, and he read them, and he talked about them, and he owned more than anybody I'd ever heard of. He loved the mountains, and he lived in them, and would rather be there walking and riding in them than be anywhere else on earth. He was curious about everything, and he wrote about everything, and he could write better and lift us up as a people better with language than perhaps any other American politician, maybe even any other American, Lincoln included. As I grew older and began to take part in American civic life, I found that his words conveyed the very essence of what it meant, of what was unique about America, a concept that we still struggle with, and a lot of other people in the world do, as we know, especially today. If there be any among us, he said, who wish to dissolve this union or change its form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. In this country, we don't kill those whom we disagree with politically. We engage them in the intellectual arena, and we tolerate them, even if just grudgingly. But we don't lock them up, we don't silence them, and we don't kill them. During a visit to Jefferson's office in the White House, a German scientist, Baron von Humboldt, saw a newspaper in the president's study filled with all sorts of invective and abuse of Jefferson. The Baron was outraged. "Why isn't this libelous journal suppressed?" he said, "or at least its editor imprisoned and fined?" Jefferson smiled at him. "Put that paper in your pocket, Baron," he said, "and should you ever hear the reality of our liberty, the freedom of the press, questioned, show them that paper and tell them where you got it." It's as if you found a documentary by Michael Moore on President Bush's desk. I decided very early on that I liked this man. And yet, he wasn't perfect. Far from it. I remember my mother first pointed it out to me. We were in Washington visiting the Jefferson Memorial, and there in marble were the awe-inspiring words of the Declaration of Independence and other of his writings. I was standing there gaping at the statue and the words and taking it all in. "All those words about freedom," she said quietly, to no one in particular, "and yet he owned slaves." It was a lot for a 10-year-old to take in, and I still remember that. It startled me then, and I never forgot it. And of course, she was right. She had casually touched upon what historians have called the American paradox, which the noted Englishman Samuel Johnson summed up so bitingly in 1776 when he asked, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of slaves?" It is a paradox that bothers us almost to the point of distraction, that the author of the Declaration of Independence was also one of the largest slaveholders of his time. Indeed, most Americans, if asked about Thomas Jefferson, know two things about him. One, that he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that he is supposed to have had an affair with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves that produced a number of children. Two things. One historian has noted that the Hemings story, quote, has affixed itself to his reputation like a tin can that rattled through the ages and pages of history. The words of the Declaration still move us, but his relationship with slavery and with Sally Hemings still profoundly disturbs us. We may live in Hamilton's America, but it is Jefferson who still commands our attention, as perhaps no other American does. And that is because, I would argue, for better or worse, there has never been any other American like him. So again, who was Thomas Jefferson? John Adams said that Thomas Jefferson was, quote, the shadow man. His character, like the great rivers whose bottoms we cannot see and who make no noise. He was born on April 13, 1743 in Albemarle County, Virginia, at Shadwell Plantation in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains on the edge of the Virginia wilderness. He was one of 10 children, 8 of whom lived to maturity, of Peter Jefferson and Jane Randolph Jefferson. His father, Peter, was a planter, a farmer, a surveyor, and public official, a powerful man who loved the outdoors and who helped to survey the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina in 1749. He was, by all accounts, a man's man, well liked by those who knew him, a product of the southern frontier, but a man who respected learning and books and who instilled that respect in his son. He died at the age of 49 when Jefferson was only 14 years old, and the loss was a profound one for the boy. His mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, was born in London and was a member of one of Virginia's most prominent families, the Randolphs. She lived to within a few months of his writing the Declaration, but Jefferson didn't say much about her, and apparently they didn't get along very well. Washington didn't get along with his mother either. He had 6 sisters, one of whom was retarded, and one younger brother, Randolph. His youngest sister and his brother were twins. Jefferson was reading books in his father's library by the age of 6, and he taught himself how to play the violin. Though no doubt he had more than his fair share of brains, I think it's safe to say, he also had good teachers who inspired and challenged him. First, his father, then the Reverend James Maury, from whom he learned Greek, Latin, and French between the ages of 14 and 16. Then Dr. William Small, the Scotsman, who was his principal instructor at William and Mary, where he enrolled at the age of 17, the first in his father's family to go to college. Dr. Small, he said, fixed the destinies of my life, and it was under his watchful eye that he studied science, math, rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. It was Dr. Small who introduced him to George Wythe, the preeminent legal mind of Virginia, the first American law professor and an apostle of the Enlightenment. This young man impressed these scholars, and he was invited to be a frequent dinner guest of Wyth's and Governor Francis Fauquier. In later life, he called his years in Williamsburg the finest school of manners and morals that existed in America. And of those dinners in particular, he said, "I heard more good sense, more rational and philosophical conversation than in all my life besides." His career afterward belonged to the nation and the world, but it was in Williamsburg, as he often said, that he trained himself for the work of his life. Jefferson's resume is impressive by any standard and in any age. Graduate of the College of William and Mary at 19, where he studied up to 15 hours a day. Admitted to the Virginia Bar at 23. A delegate to the Virginia House of Burgesses at 25. The Second Continental Congress at 32. Author of the Declaration of Independence at 33. Governor of Virginia from the ages of 36 to 38. For some reason, that's the one that really impresses me. Minister of France at 41. The First Secretary of State at 47. Second Vice President at 54. Third President at 58. Founder of the University of Virginia in his 70s. And all the while, he pursued political, legal, agricultural, architectural, scientific, and literary pursuits, wrote a book, and of course kept up a correspondence with people all over the world about every subject under the sun and usually beyond. He inherited land from his father, and at a time when most Virginia planters built their homes along the riverbanks to make shipment of their crops easier, Jefferson, of course, defied convention and built his home atop a mountain. He grew up during the height of the European Enlightenment, and he fully absorbed its spirit of intellectual optimism. His home at Monticello is a living testament to the Enlightenment and a monument to the man himself. The home perhaps more closely identified and embodying the spirit and personality of its builder and owner than any other home in America. The Marquis de Chastellux called him a master of the fine art of shelter. He loved his mountaintop home, and millions of Americans to this day still do. And why not? It wasn't and isn't just a house. It was a museum, a library, an art gallery, a science laboratory, an agricultural experiment station, and a place where good music, good food, and learned and interesting conversation were the rule, not the exception. It is still possible, when you're there, to believe that he's just around the corner. It was for Jefferson, in every sense of the word, a retreat from the world below and its cares and worries. Indeed, before he learned Italian and named it Monticello, which means according to the mountain, he called it the Hermitage. He would build and rebuild it, tear it down, and transform it, tinker with it, and improve upon it all his life. "Architecture is my delight," he said, and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements. And what of the man himself who lived there? He was tall, about 6'2", thin, with red hair that grew sandy as he aged. He was good with words, a much better writer than a speaker, however, and would grow to become a consummate politician, but yet one who hated open conflict. Here is the description of Jefferson made by a Frenchman who visited Monticello in the fall of 1781. "Let me describe to you a man not yet 40, tall, with a mild and pleasing countenance. An American who, without ever having quitted his own country, is at once a musician, skilled in drawing, a geometrician, an astronomer, a natural philosopher," that is what we would today call a scientist, "and statesman. Before I had been 2 hours with him, we were as intimate as if we passed our whole lives together. Above all, the conversation, always varied and interesting, made 4 days pass away like so many minutes." One of his slaves many years later described him this way: "About his own home, he was the quietest of men. He was hardly ever known to get angry, though sometimes he was irritated when matters went wrong. But even then, he hardly allowed himself to be made unhappy any great length of time. He occupied much of the time in his office, engaged in correspondence and reading and writing. His general temperament was smooth and even. He was very undemonstrative. He was uniformly kind to all around him." Mr. Jefferson was always an early riser, his overseer remembered. Arose at daybreak or before. The sun never found him in bed. "I used sometimes to think when I went up there very early in the morning that I would find him in bed, but there he would be, always before me, walking on the terrace. He wrote letters from daybreak till breakfast about 9 o'clock, and then if the weather was nice, he would venture out on horseback for several hours. His granddaughter, Ellen Wells Coolidge, recalled that, quote, as the day in summer grew warmer, he retired to his own apartment, which consisted of a bedchamber and library opening into each other. Here he remained until about 1 o'clock, occupied in reading, writing, looking over papers. My mother would sometimes send me with a message to him. The a gentle knock, a call, come in, and I would enter with a mixed feeling of love and reverence, and some pride in being the bearer of a communication to one whom I approached with all the affection of a child and something of the loyalty of a subject. Dinner was at 4, coffee at 6, and then lively conversation with his family and reading till his bedtime at 9. In his later years, he might go out on the lawn in the afternoons and watch his grandchildren race. He placed us according to our ages, his granddaughter recalled, giving the youngest and the smallest a start of all the others by some yards. And then he raised his arm high with his white handkerchief in his hand, and our eager eyes would fix on it, and slowly he would count 3, and then drop the handkerchief, and off we would start. We were much tired by the time we returned, she said, and came panting out of breath, throw ourselves into our grandfather's arms, which were opened to receive us. He pressed us to his bosom and rewarded us with a kiss. He was sitting on the grass, and we sat down with him. As a girl, another one recalled, I would join him in his walks on the terrace, sit with him by the fire during the winter twilight, or by the open windows in summer. I loved him and honored him above all earthly things. Gives you a picture, doesn't it? Still, those were his grandchildren. When it came to his own children, he was a somewhat demanding father, we might say. He sent this note to his daughter Patsy, who was only 11 years old at the time, and there were many more like her. Quote, I expect that you will write to me at every post. Inform me what books you read, what tunes you learn, and enclose me your best copy of every lesson in drawing. Take care that you never spell a word wrong. I have placed my happiness on seeing you good and accomplished, and no distress which this world can bring on me will ever equal that of you disappointing my hopes. That's a lot for an 11-year-old. But then it must have been very difficult having a father like Thomas Jefferson. There at his mountaintop home, Jefferson indulged his passion for all things interesting. He was always fascinated by new gadgets and labor-saving devices, and his home, as you know, if you've been there, is full of them. His 7-day clock, portable writing desk, his dumbwaiter, and his polygraph, which is, of course, an ingenious device that made copies of his letters. He invented the swivel chair and won a gold medal from a French agricultural society for a plow mold board that turned the soil more efficiently than those then in use. He encouraged Italian wine growers to settle in Virginia and from them learn how to raise grapes, garlic, oranges, and endive. He imported America's first merino sheep from Spain. He was ahead of his time in that he advocated eating only moderate amounts of meat and lots of fresh vegetables and believed in daily exercise for good health. He rode on horseback every day up to 4 hours, didn't smoke, and enjoyed wine with dinner, though he preferred to like French wines to their heavier Italian counterparts. And it is a fact that he's well known for that his White House wine bill totaled over $10,000 after 8 years. A staggering amount by modern standards. He loved music and played the violin very well. His overseer remembered, quote, I have rode over the plantation, I reckon, 1,000 times with Mr. Jefferson, and when he was not talking, he was nearly always humming some tune or singing in a low tone to himself. And then, of course, there were his books. He loved books, and his private library was one of the best ever assembled. Jefferson read the classics in their original language, Cicero in Latin, Plato in Greek, Montesquieu in French, and Cervantes in Spanish. I cannot live without books, he told John Adams, and his library eventually became the nucleus of the Library of Congress. When British troops destroyed the original library in 1814 in Washington, Jefferson offered his personal collection for a token of its cost. Congress paid him about $24,000 for his 6,500 volumes, which filled up 10 wagon loads there at his home. And when those wagons were finally packed and loaded, ready for their trip to Washington, anyone who truly loves books can just imagine what a sad and heartbreaking day it was for Jefferson. To console himself, of course, he started buying more books. One granddaughter's fondest memories were of those books and the evenings at Monticello. When the candles were brought, she remembered all was quiet immediately, for he took up his book to read. And we wouldn't speak out of a whisper lest we should disturb him. And generally, we followed his example and took a book. And I have seen him raise his eyes from his book and look round on the little circle of readers and smile. This was Thomas Jefferson at his happiest, on his mountaintop, in his beloved Monticello, surrounded by all the things he loved, especially his books, his neighbors, and his family. All my wishes in, he said, where I hope my days will end, at Monticello. And of course, he got his wish. It was to Monticello that he brought the woman he called the cherished companion of my life, his wife, Martha Wales Skelton. She was the 23-year-old daughter of John Wales and the widow of a man named Bathurst Skelton, who was one of Jefferson's classmates of William and Mary. He married her on New Year's Day, 1772, when he was 28, and they were together for 10 years of what Jefferson described as uncheckered happiness, until her death following complications of childbirth. She gave birth 6 times in those 10 years, though only 2 daughters lived to maturity. Indeed, of the 6 children born to Jefferson, he buried 5 of them before he died, a tragedy for any parent, even in an age when infant deaths were all too common. He called his wife Patty, and she was beautiful, graceful, and fond of music. We don't know much about her because Jefferson destroyed all of their letters after her death, an event which nearly destroyed him as well. By all accounts, Thomas and Martha Jefferson deeply loved each other, and according to eyewitnesses, she told him on her deathbed that having been raised under a stepmother herself, she feared for her children if a stepmother was brought in to raise her own. And he promised her that he would never remarry. And he never did, though he lived another 44 years. His daughter Patsy, then 10 years old, recalled years later that after she died, he didn't leave his room for 3 weeks. And when he finally came out, he saw solace in his farm and the mountains he loved. He was incessantly on horseback, she said, rambling about the mountain and the least frequented roads and just as often through the woods. And in these melancholy rambles, I was his constant companion, a solitary witness to many a violent burst of grief. During those years of uncheckered happiness, the American nation was born, and Thomas Jefferson was at the heart of the beginnings of the Revolutionary movement. In 1774, while serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he wrote a pamphlet entitled A Summary View of the Rights of British America, in which he argued that since the association between the English crown and the colonies was entirely voluntary, Parliament had no authority over them whatsoever. The gracefulness of his prose and the forcefulness of his argument brought him national attention, and in the spring of 1776, Virginia sent him to Philadelphia as one of the delegates to the colony's representatives in the Second Continental Congress. John Adams took an instant liking to this tall, quiet Virginian. During the whole time I sat with him in Congress, Adams said later, I never heard him put 3 sentences together and say them out loud. But he possessed what Adams called a happy talent of composition, and his reputation as a skilled writer had preceded him. So, at the young age of 33, he was placed on the committee appointed to write out the statement that these representatives would place before the world to justify the dangerous and revolutionary step they were about to take. When that committee met, he was chosen to write the draft. In a small room in a boarding house on Market Street in that crowded, bustling, and hot city, Thomas Jefferson sat down without notes, and in a few days, interrupted only by his violin, he hammered out the blueprint for what has undeniably become the American creed. In 1776, kings still ruled over England and France. All the millions of Russia, China, and Japan were ruled by a czarina, a divinely invested emperor, and a shogun. But in 1776, in Philadelphia, a small group of farmers, lawyers, and businessmen met to see if they might govern themselves and throw off the shackles of monarchy and launch a new government in self-government, a new experiment in self-government, and they chose this young man to speak for them. His aim, he said later, was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we were compelled to take. What he came up with, he said, was merely an expression of the American mind. These words still move us. Listen to them and try to remember how earth-shattering they were when he wrote them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Dangerous and subversive words. Americans didn't agree then and have argued ever since over what Jefferson meant by those words and who was to be included. At the time, Jefferson didn't mean what we might want him to mean when he wrote that all men are equal. But once the genie was out of the bottle, it couldn't mean anything else. They must have all known that by opening a door to human freedom for some, its principles must eventually apply to both sexes and every race, creed, and color. But the next part of the document, though often overlooked, is equally as powerful and inspirational and has proven to be the most revolutionary of all. Particularly poignant on this day. Listen closely. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. Those words would pull down monarchies, overthrow tyrants, and topple empires. They would send young American men to the beaches of Normandy. In the end, we must never underestimate the fact that Jefferson assaulted the notion that had governed mankind since the beginning of time, that a natural inequality existed among human beings, which meant that some men and women would always be there to serve a favored few. That's the way it had always been. Americans continue to grapple with the notion that all men, and women too, are created equal, and they still cannot agree on just what is and what is not an inalienable right. But here in the Declaration of Independence is the very essence of what it means to be an American. If other countries were founded long ago on tribal identities or in the ancient mist of time, we know that our country was founded on an idea, and we know the very place and the afternoon that it began. It was perhaps an unattainable idea, a challenge placed before us and every generation of Americans that has come after that we have struggled to live up to. But if Jefferson had done nothing else in his life, his scratching out those words on a piece of parchment in that small room in Market Street on Philadelphia would have made him, I think, a great American. He thought so too. But of course, he did more than that, much more. He went on to serve his state as governor and failed at it miserably. He succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France and was on hand to witness what he believed was the opening round of the cataclysmic struggle to bring true freedom to Europe, the French Revolution. He served as the first Secretary of State and founded the first American political party, the Democratic Republicans, which fought Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists tooth and nail over which direction this young republic would take and over what the American Revolution really meant. He served as Vice President and presided over the peaceful transfer of power that followed his own controversial election to the presidency in 1800, the first in which the reins of government were passed from one party to another, and it happened without armies, without guns, without bloodshed. He called it the Revolution of 1800. And despite his belief in small government, he welcomed the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 that effectively doubled the size of the country, and his administration financed the Lewis and Clark expedition that explored the new territory and opened up the American heartland. After a bumpy and controversial second term as president, he retired to his beloved Monticello at the age of 66, and he never left Virginia again. He didn't feel he needed to. He felt there was still a lot to do there. And he founded the University of Virginia in his 70s. It was a remarkable and unparalleled life of achievement and service. So, what has become of Jefferson's place in history and in our lives? Despite his awe-inspiring words in the Declaration and his leadership in the Republic's founding years, historians and much of the public have looked unfavorably upon him in the last generation. During the 1960s and 70s, Americans became more cynical about their government and about their politicians in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. They also became more cynical about the way the history of this country had always been written, with this emphasis heavily weighted toward the white men who were so instrumental in founding this country and the supposedly great virtues that they possessed. After Paul Brody's 1974 book called Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate Biography, laid out the whole Hemmings-Jefferson story, and quite convincingly too, Jefferson appeared as a flawed and contradictory figure who increasingly had to bear the burden and responsibility of all that was wrong with the race in America. And no one can stand up under that burden. For of course, all of Jefferson's achievements were accomplished against the backdrop of slavery. He aspired toward a lifestyle that made him completely dependent upon their labor. They were silent witnesses to every great thing he did and every companions on every journey he ever took. One of his slaves shared his room on Market Street in Philadelphia as he wrote the Declaration. His slaves traveled with him to Paris, Philadelphia, and Washington, built and rebuilt Monticello to his designs, and in general, as he put it, labored for my happiness. And despite the notion that he was an enlightened slave owner, he, like most planners, kept an eye on the bottom line and he was not above selling slaves and breaking up families when economic necessity required. He gave his slaves away as wedding presents. He made young slave children work in his nail factory 12 to 14 hours a day. Despite all his beliefs and words, it turns out that Mr. Jefferson was very much a man of his time. The Hemmings story first came to light in September 1802, and one historian has called it the longest-running miniseries in American history. James Callender didn't make up the story, he heard it. A disgruntled office seeker picked up some local Charlottesville gossip and published it in a Richmond newspaper. Jefferson, he said, kept an African Venus as his concubine, and he identified the woman as Sally Hemings, a slave who, as a young girl, had accompanied Jefferson's daughter Polly to France in 1787 when she was 14, and whom Jefferson acquired through his wife's father's estate. In fact, his father-in-law, John Wales, was believed to have had a long-time affair with Sally's mother, Betty. Now, this, of course, would make Sally Hemings the half-sister to Jefferson's wife, Martha. There must indeed have been a very strong physical resemblance between the two. In 1998, DNA testing established that a Jefferson male had fathered Eston Hemings, Sally Hemings' last child. Didn't say Jefferson had, but said a Jefferson male had. Many historians now believe and accept that Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children, citing all sorts of evidence. The fact that in his farm book he doesn't name the father of Sally's children, while the entries of other slave births always do. She had 5 children altogether, beginning in 1795 when she was 22, and Jefferson was at Monticello 9 months before the birth of every one of those children. Indeed, she never conceived when he wasn't there, during his long absences in Philadelphia and Washington. Members of the Hemings family were the only slaves freed at his death. Not necessarily Sally's children, but also extended members of the Hemings family. He also petitioned the legislature in Virginia to continue to let them live in Virginia, as an exception to a law that stipulated that all freed slaves had to leave the state within a year. And contemporaries often commented on the simple fact of how much her children looked like Jefferson. But the dissenters, and I can tell you folks, there are many, and I have heard from them myself, say, and there's been a lot of ink spill on it, that Jefferson had no male heir, and DNA can only establish paternity through an unbroken male line. They're right. Researchers had used tissue taken from a living descendant of Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson. Critics of the study point to the fact that there were 18 Jefferson males in Virginia during the period when Hemings had her children who could have been the father. And they're right about that, too, though only Thomas Jefferson lived in close proximity to her. Others point out that Thomas Jefferson was not such a fool as to have had a 38-year relationship with a slave under his own roof with her own daughter living right there with him. Monticello is big, but it's not that big. And surely that sort of thing could never have gone on long or remained hidden from white relatives and the larger slave community. Other critics argue that it would have been the height of political folly to continue to have children with a slave even after the story broke in the national press in 1802. Yet her last 2 children, Madison and Eston, were indeed born after that date. Now, of course, we know that presidents can do some remarkably foolish things, even when they know they're not watched. But the fact remains that someone with Jefferson male DNA was having sex with Sally Hemings, at least when her last child was born in 1807. Several of her children were obviously fathered by a white man, and many of them had features that resembled Thomas Jefferson. James Callender, though no doubt a scandal monger, had nevertheless been right on a couple of other things that he had reported. He is the one who broke the story of the adulterous affair between Alexander Hamilton and Maria Reynolds in 1797. He also accused Jefferson of making advances to a married woman when he was a young man of 25. Jefferson admitted it. In fact, the only time historians believe he ever even obliquely commented on the Hemings affair was when he said, "I acknowledge the charge of that truth, the only one among all of the charges against me." Why did any of this matter? Well, we're told it matters because she was his slave and she could not resist his advances, if indeed he forced himself on her, while he was a white male into whose care she had been entrusted. Literally, he owned her. And most of all, he wrote the Declaration of Independence and must therefore be held to a higher standard than others of the founding era. Others of his critics argue that even if it was an affair between 2 people who genuinely loved each other, in other words, it was not coerced, Jefferson was opposed to race mixing and said so and wrote so many, many times. At best, he comes off looking, they say, like a monumental hypocrite, and at worst, some have argued, his behavior makes a mockery of the idea that he could be called an apostle of freedom. Slavery, it turns out, did bother him, but he didn't think he or his generation could do anything about it. We have the wolf by the ears, he said, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, self-preservation in the other. The optimism of his youth gave way to the political realities of his middle years. Jefferson could either be a determined abolitionist or an effective politician. And there was never really any doubt about what he was going to be. But he knew that he and his country were going to pay a price for that choice. He prophetically wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice will not sleep forever." Instead of acting himself, however, he counseled patience and reliance on those who will follow. When asked by a young Virginian in 1814 to lend his voice to emancipation, he would only say, quote, "The hour of emancipation is advancing in the march of time. It will come." But he wouldn't even say that publicly. "The abolition of the evil is not impossible," he said in August 1825. "It ought never, therefore, to be despaired of." Still, he believed, if they were freed, they would have to be sent to Africa or the West Indies and couldn't remain in the United States. In his book, Notes from the State of Virginia, he asserted, quote, "Nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith than that these people are to be free. Nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion have drawn indelible lines of distinction between them." He thought there would be too much racism on the part of whites and too much resentment and anger on the part of blacks for the two races to ever live together. He saw down what road the quandary would take his beloved Virginia and the republic that he had helped to found. He called the controversy of 1820 over whether Missouri would come into the Union as a slave or a free state a fire bell in the night, which awakened and filled me with terror. The controversy caused him to make the most pessimistic and fatalistic remark about America and its future that he ever wrote. "I regret," he said, "that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of our sons. And my only consolation is that I will not live to weep over it." Is it fair to judge Jefferson harsher than we judge his contemporaries? Is it fair to perhaps judge him by standards that are ours and not his? Is it fair to judge him and them at all? One might answer that holding other human beings in bondage was morally wrong then, and that a lot of Americans thought so. Jefferson himself had moral qualms, huge moral qualms about slavery, and he mentally wrestled with it all of his life. So you could say we aren't really judging him by our standards. There have always been some moral absolutes through time. Murder, for instance, has always been murder. Other historians give Jefferson credit for at least confronting the slave society into which he was born and for morally condemning slavery and putting it on the defensive in this country, when in fact it had existed comfortably and without restraint for over 150 years. In fact, you could argue that that is the greatest gift of the revolutionary generation of all. They put slavery and every other kind of thing like it on the road to extinction, even if they themselves did not extinguish it. To expect more of Jefferson than he did seems almost superhuman. To expect more of someone born at that time, in that place, who grew up in the Virginia aristocracy, a wealthy southern man who lived in a big house dependent on the growth of staple crops, harvested by humans held in bondage, is to expect almost too much. But we do expect it of him, though, don't we? Some people say Jefferson isn't just anybody. We're not talking about James Madison or John Marshall or some other person. Nobody could have gotten us to believe what we believe, pushed us to be who we are. We're talking about Jefferson. The other founders never asked us to be better than what we were. Jefferson did, but he himself couldn't live up to his own lofty language, and we somehow falter for that. We expect more of him somehow, and we are often disappointed, some of us are, when we don't get it. But is that fair? Benjamin Franklin doesn't disappoint us because he never had to make his lifestyle fit his rhetoric. He never had to make that choice. In his personal life, Franklin contracted syphilis from a prostitute when he was young, and fathered a child out of wedlock. He spent the last 10 years away from his wife and just seemed to ignore her letters, and she died alone. But we wink at his transgressions, smile good-naturedly at his roguish behavior. He's sort of the founder that we like to have a beer with. He is not made to bear the burden of being the father of the decline of morals in this country, the way Jefferson bears the burden of race. Franklin never relied upon slaves for his livelihood, and it wasn't a great mental or moral leap for him to become an outspoken abolitionist in his old age, as he did. This isn't meant to pick on Franklin or excuse Jefferson, merely to say that I think we need to put both men in the context of their times, to explain and to understand Jefferson and millions of other Americans like him who believed exactly what he believed at that time. Jefferson, as we've seen, was not opposed to abolition, but he never imagined that free slaves could or would want to live in the same society as whites. By our standards, he is an Anglo-Saxon white supremacist. But to reduce him to that, or to dismiss him as nothing more than that, I think is very short-sighted and unfortunate. If we simply condemn and dismiss, we gain nothing by way of understanding. And that, I think, is what we always want to do with history. It's tempting, I think, for Jefferson to play what if. And I don't mean to dwell on this subject, but it gets so much attention. What if Jefferson had come out publicly against slavery? We can argue about how many minds he would have changed in South Carolina and Georgia, because remember from the very beginning in 1774, the First Continental Congress, even before there were southern states, the southern colonies, threatened to flood the entire experiment if anything like a national government were ever given any power over slavery. The same thing happened in 1787. There very likely would have been two United States from the beginning, a northern and a southern one, and we can only speculate what might have happened after that. The same thing, of course, happened in 1820. By then, slavery had spread everywhere. It's hard to believe that slavery and the spread of slavery could ever have been effectively abolished in this country except in the way that it was, by force of arms, even as early as the Revolutionary generation. More likely, if Jefferson had said, I am going to be an outspoken abolitionist, he would have been written off as a raving lunatic by the very people that he would have most needed to convince to follow his lead. Other people, however, say, you're wrong. One man with a powerful voice who stands up and says, this is what we believe in and this is who we are, you never know what kind of influence they will have. And they're right too. And that, I think, is the tragedy of Jefferson and slavery. They will always be a conundrum that we will struggle to reconcile. Now, no afternoon with Jefferson will be complete without asking him what he would think about the world and times in which we live. Without question, I think that he would have loved much of our technology. A man who wrote 18,000 letters would have loved email and its instant communication. A man who loved knowledge and information would have loved the internet and would have had Monticello wired for a high-speed connection. A man who filled countless day books with temperature readings and planting schedules would have no doubt owned a laptop and a Palm Pilot, and he would have created a database into which he would have logged every conceivable scrap of information about Monticello. With the AutoCAD computer program, he could have redesigned and rebuilt Monticello 1,000 times without ever lifting a hammer. His cell phone bill would have been outrageous, I think, as would his monthly statement from Amazon.com. A little brown UPS truck chugging up the mountain, bringing books to Mr. Jefferson would have been a familiar and welcome sight on the mountaintop. He would have been a devotee of Home and Garden Television, the Weather Channel, and I'm certain that he would have never missed an episode of This Old House. In fact, I think he probably would have invited Norm Abrams and Tom Silva to come work on Monticello. More seriously, I think he would be glad to know that slavery did indeed end not long after his death, though perhaps not in the way he would have chosen. I would like to think he would admit that he was wrong about the ability of blacks and whites to live together in this country and would be pleased at how far we've come in terms of race relations. I think he would be proud to know of the role his own words played in the struggle for civil rights in the 20th century and to see how many people of all races have been inspired by the words on that document. What would his reaction be when told that African Americans had served as governor of his own state of Virginia? I think the thing that would have surprised Jefferson and that generation the most, more than anything else, would be the role played by women in our public life today. He could not have imagined it. Madison, in fact, one time asked him about appointing women to post because there weren't enough Republicans to go around and fill these posts. And he said, that is something for which neither the country nor I am ready. And that was really that. I think there would have been parts that he would strongly disagree with, however, in our public world. Even in his own day, he lamented the rise of evangelical religion and the increasingly influential role it played in American life. It was this he was talking about. Just 10 days before his death, he said that the Declaration of Independence, quote, will be the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition have persuaded them to bind themselves. He was talking about what he called revealed religion, which he found incompatible with democracy and an open society. When one man or a group feels that God has revealed the truth to him or them alone, Jefferson said he is very likely to be intolerant of others' views and opinions. I think he would have been vehemently opposed to prayer in school and any and all influence of religion in the public realm. It was he, after all, not the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, who coined the phrase wall of separation. It's true that he sent his own daughters to Catholic convent school in Paris, but only because it was the best place to send them with the kind of education he wanted them to have. The moment his eldest daughter professed a desire to become a nun, he immediately appeared at the school, conferred briefly with the abbess who ran it, and then drove off with both daughters and all their belongings. I think if his carriage had rubber wheels, they would have squealed. To him, one's religious beliefs were an intensely personal matter. This is what he said. I never told my own religion nor scrutinized that of another. I never attempted to make a convert nor wished to change another's creed. I have ever judged of the religion of others by their lives, he said. For it is in our lives and not from our words that our religion must be read. One of his most cherished accomplishments was drafting the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty in 1786, which asserted, quote, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion. It was a hard and difficult fight, but when it passed, he rejoiced. Quote, after so many ages during which the human mind has been held in vassalage by kings, priests, and nobles, it is honorable for us to have produced the first legislature who had the courage to declare that the reason of man may be trusted with the formation of his own opinions. James Madison believed, erroneously as it turns out, that this statute, he said, extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind. Jefferson thus gained a reputation as a champion of religious freedom, even in his own time. But many at the time denounced him, as you might expect, as a wild-eyed liberal atheist. For him, it was not so much a matter of whether God actually existed or not, but that all sides should be heard and tolerated, and that none should be supported or suppressed by government. It does me no injury, he said, for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Though he occasionally attended church service, he never belonged to any organized religion or particular church, and hoped, he thought, the world was eventually we were all going to be Unitarians. In the strictest sense of the label, he was never a Christian because he never believed Christ was the Messiah. He never bestowed any special powers on Jesus other than the power of his message, which he believed was moral. And because of his sympathy for the French Revolution and his liberal views on religion, Federalist conservatives called him a radical. And I used to laugh at these three parts because I thought how ludicrous, but see if any of this sounds familiar to you. And said that if he became president, all Bibles would be burned, property rights destroyed, and the marriage institution abolished. To accuse Jefferson, a lifelong book lover, of wanting to burn books is perhaps the ultimate irony. His passion, as we know, was reading books, not burning or banning them, and he would have been appalled then and now, I think, by any attempt to do so. He had nothing but contempt for ignorance. I'm not sure how he would feel about our huge standing army. We live in a different world than he did. He didn't have to worry about international terrorism. It was he, after all, who founded West Point, another Jefferson paradox. I'm quite certain he would have hated the IRS and any and all secret government agencies and been appalled at the size of our federal government now. He believed in limited government and unlimited freedom, and he said so all the time, but he didn't live in a time when big corporations, left unchecked, might steal your pension. I think it's safe to say in the end he would not be very comfortable in our world, but we wouldn't be very comfortable in his either. He was always optimistic. Nevertheless, he told John Adams in 1816, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." Still, as we've seen, the rumblings over slavery disturbed him deeply. By the 1820s, when he saw the light fading, the world was rapidly changing in ways that Jefferson found bewildering and sometimes even terrifying. America was becoming more democratic, more rough and tumble, more capitalistic. People were not becoming more refined, more polite, more sociable, as he hoped and believed. If anything, America was becoming more barbaric and more factional. The divisions between them frightened him. And the popularity of men like Andrew Jackson disturbed him deeply. He thought Jackson was a man of violent passions and unfit for the presidency. At the same time, his mounting and crushing debt made him realize he was not going to leave his children and grandchildren with the great estate that he had hoped. He was reduced to pleading with the Virginia legislature for financial liberty. In doing so, he had to list his accomplishments across 60 years of service, as if they had no idea who he was or what he had ever done. He found the whole experience depressing and humiliating, and he said so. All dead, he despaired to an old friend, and ourselves left alone amidst a new generation, whom we know not, and who knows not us. The brightest part of Jefferson's old age was the renewal of his friendship with his friend John Adams. They had become estranged during the turbulent 1790s and hadn't spoken to each other in years until their fellow revolutionary Benjamin Rush interceded, and they began writing to each other again in 1812. Adams had earlier told a friend that despite their political differences, "I always loved Jefferson, and I still love him." That's all Jefferson had to hear. Tentatively at first, and then embracingly, these two old friends reached out to each other in their twilight years. And it is no overstatement to say that the correspondence between these two American giants over 14 years and 158 letters is a national treasure, what one historian has called the intellectual capstone of the achievements of the revolutionary generation. It has all been published, and I encourage you to read it. The two men, besides Washington, who did more than anybody else to make the American Revolution a reality, spent their last years explaining that event to each other, and they knew they were talking across the ages to us. "You and I ought not to die," Adams said, "before we have explained ourselves to each other." And Jefferson agreed. Looking back across the years made them both young again. And in the 1820s, when it seemed that the country was going to tear itself apart, they recalled with pleasure, as Adams put it, those golden days when Virginia and Massachusetts lived and acted together like a band of brothers. "While I breathe," he said, "I shall be your friend." Jefferson retained his lifelong optimism to the end. They asked each other, "Would you do it again if you had the chance?" And Adams said he wouldn't. He'd lost everything. He lost his wife. He'd lost children. He couldn't do it again. Jefferson, remember, had buried 5 of his children. He had lost his wife. But being the optimist, he said he'd do it all again in all he'd lost. He told Adams near the end that they had lived like Argonauts in the heroic age, and they had successfully brought their ships safely home. He and Adams, he said, were about to disembark. A new crew had come aboard, and the ship could safely be entrusted to their hands. "I console myself with the reflection," Jefferson told his old friend, "that those who come after us will be as wise as we are, and as able to take care of themselves as we have been." As July 4th, 1826 approached, the 50th anniversary of the great date, Jefferson was sinking fast. Plagued by prostate cancer, he was in great pain, losing strength rapidly, and confined to his bed. He slipped into a coma on July 2nd and awoke briefly on the evening of the 3rd. "Is it the 4th?" he hopefully asked his young friend sitting beside the bed. It wasn't, and he could not bring himself to say so. "Is it the 4th?" he asked again, determined to hold out, and this time his friend said that it was. He sighed, great satisfaction, laid back in bed, and never said another word. Died in his sleep a little before 1 o'clock the next afternoon on July 4th, 1826, not coincidentally at just the minute, they say, 50 years earlier, that his committee had presented a declaration to the Second Continental Congress. He was 83 years old. Several hundred miles to the north, that same afternoon, 90-year-old John Adams lay dying in bed in Quincy, Massachusetts. When he awoke briefly that afternoon, someone asked him, "Do you know what day it is?" "Ah, yes," he said. "It is the glorious 4th. God bless it. God bless you all."